Hello and welcome to the first lesson in our introductory module of this real estate and REIT financial modeling course. We're going to cover four main topics in this lesson. First, I'm going to explain what this course covers. Second, I'm going to explain what it doesn't cover and why, even if you're in this course right now, you may want to take another course first or perhaps change your enrollment and move to another course before completing this one. Third, we'll introduce you to the different property types and investment strategies out there and explain how you can make money in real estate and how these different property types and strategies differ. And then fourth, we'll say a few brief words on how to use this course efficiently and effectively. Let's go into part one first and talk about what this course covers. At a high level, we feature two main topics here: individual properties and then real estate investment trusts, or REITs, which are entities that manage, acquire, develop, and sell hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of individual properties. If you are working in commercial real estate as a developer or at a development firm or in brokerage or something else like that, or in real estate private equity, or you're on the commercial real estate lending side, all the lessons on individual properties here are going to be far more relevant for you. Now, if you're in investment banking, then the real estate investment trust lessons will be more relevant. Also, if you're in any role that actually works with REITs, such as if you're at a hedge fund that specializes in REITs or real estate or something like that, then the REIT lessons will be the most relevant ones. Our goal is to prepare you efficiently for Excel-based case studies and interviews and get you up to speed on the job quickly. This course is different from a lot of the other real estate courses and textbooks out there because our focus is on the interview style case studies you might receive. That means that we're mostly going to be focused on case studies that take 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, up to a few hours to complete. And we choose to focus on that over bells and whistles because in our experience, most candidates simply want to prepare for interviews, and even if they're on the job, they want to get up to speed quickly without having to go through a 5,000-row spreadsheet. Also, we do cover both properties and REITs, whereas most other courses and sources out there tend to focus on one or the other. Let's go into point two and talk about what this course does not cover. First off, we're not going to go into Excel or basic accounting and finance knowledge here. If you don't already have these, then you should look at our Excel and fundamentals course, which is a prerequisite for this one. As a simple test, you can ask yourself this: do you know what PV, NPV, and IRR mean? And do you know how to calculate them in Excel? If someone gave you a big data set in Excel, would you know how to use the index and match functions to find and locate data in there? If you don't know how to do this or you don't know the answers to these questions, then you should really look at the Excel and fundamentals course first. You can sign up for it separately or you can change your enrollment. Just email us and let us know what you want to do. Also, we're not going to cover every single combination of models and property types and REITs. There is a lot out there and you could come up with hundreds of different combinations based on the region and the time period and the property type you're focusing on. But again, our goal is efficiency. Some people like to brag and say that it took 200 hours or 500 hours to build our model. We approach it very differently, and we try to come up with models and case studies that might take a few hours up to a week or so to complete. Now, if you do want all those bells and whistles, there are other options out there. Some companies and platforms teach only real estate modeling and specialize in that, whereas we cover dozens of different industries across all the courses here. So if you want that specialist treatment, I encourage you to investigate other options and sign up for all those bells and whistles. We're also not going to cover Argus or other non-Excel based software in this course. Yes, these can be very useful and they're commonly used in the real estate industry, but again, it's just not our focus area. We teach Excel-based financial modeling, and in a few cases, we will cover how to use the output from Argus in Excel, but this is not an Argus tutorial. The software is very expensive and somewhat complicated and time-consuming to learn. Not everyone has it, and so we're going to focus on Excel here. Finally, we're not going to cover non-property or REIT analysis. So for example, we're not going to go into private equity fund modeling. We're not going to cover gaming, lodging, or home building companies. We're not going to cover real estate operating companies or commercial mortgage-backed securities, CMBS. The basic problem with all of these is that they're either too normal or they're too specialized. For example, home building companies Although they are related to real estate, really they're almost the same as normal companies. They consider homes that they build to be inventory listed on their balance sheet, and then they sell the homes as inventory when they're done. So all the special treatments and metrics and ratios that you use for real estate investment trusts don't really apply to these types of companies. And then with something like commercial mortgage-backed securities, it's quite difficult to teach because it's very specialized. There's hardly any reference material out there. I haven't really seen any comprehensive courses on this topic, so we're just not covering it here. Now, some material in this course may apply to some of these areas, but it's not our focus. And if we tried to cover all this, quite frankly, the course would probably be over 500 hours long, so we want to avoid that. Let's now go into part 3 and talk about the different property types and strategies. When you think about individual properties, the first one that probably comes to mind is an office or a retail property or an industrial property. Anything where it is long-term leased to businesses for business purposes. So a business needs to rent office space and they go and rent office space. And you own an office building where the tenants, these companies, can rent office space. Retail, such as shopping malls or shopping centers, falls into basically the same category because it's leased for the long term to businesses for business purposes. And industrial properties, such as manufacturing plants, also fall into the same area. Another major area is called multifamily, which basically refers to apartments that are being rented out to individuals or families. Now, the difference here is, first off, the lease terms tend to be a lot shorter. You're not going to see a 10-year lease on an apartment. Most leases are 1 year, sometimes even less than that, sometimes a little bit more than that. They're not leased to businesses, but to individuals or families. And they're not being leased for business purposes, but for residential purposes instead. They're places to live, sleep, raise a family, and so on. A third category are condominiums. Now, these are similar to apartments in some ways, but the difference is that they're sold, they're not leased out. So someone who purchases a condominium actually owns it. They're not going to pay rent. They will pay some other fees and will have to cover other expenses, but they're not paying rent to a landlord because they actually own the property. Individuals and families still buy them, and they're still for residential purposes. But the key difference is that there's ownership. Also, another key difference is that unlike many of these other property types, they're often sold in advance of completion. So a developer will announce plans to build a bunch of condominiums. They will collect some deposits up front from people who are interested. They'll pay more deposits throughout as construction goes on. And then at the end, they'll collect final deposits and the people will move in. That process is very different from all the other property types we're going to look at. And then finally, there are hotels or hospitality related properties. The lease term on these is even shorter. A lot of people stay at a hotel for a day or 2 days or maybe up to a week or slightly more than that. They're still with individuals, and the purpose could be either business or pleasure. You could go to a hotel for a conference or for an interview or to meet a client, or you could also go because you're on vacation with your family. So these are the 4 main categories that we're going to focus on in this course. If you were to compare them side by side, it would look something like this. Customers, office, retail, and industrial is primarily business customers, and everything else is primarily individuals for customers. With the lease type, not only do office, retail, and industrial properties tend to have the longest leases, but they also vary quite a bit. The individual terms can be significantly different between the different customers, depending on their creditworthiness, their reputation, how long they've been around as companies. With multifamily, the leases tend to be quite a bit shorter, a year's standard length. Also, the terms of the leases are quite similar in terms of deposits and the expenses that each party will cover and so on. Now, with condominiums, of course, leases don't apply because whoever purchases the condominium actually owns it. They'll often pay deposits, an upfront deposit, another deposit, and then a final or closing deposit, but there's ownership, so there are no leases. And then with hotels, lease type doesn't even really apply because it's just people staying there for a few days or a week or a few weeks at a time. Also, the terms are very similar in terms of expenses that are covered and expenses that are not covered. With the timing of the lease or sale, with pretty much everything here except for condominiums, if you go in and develop a new office, the building pretty much has to be done for you to lease the building or start selling rooms to customers. If you are developing a hotel, you can't go and try to solicit customers and say, Our hotel is under construction. It'll be done in a year. Please reserve your room right now. That just doesn't happen. The hotel has to be pretty close to done or actually done for you to go out and do it. On the other hand, with condominiums, it's very, very common to actually pre-sell them in advance before the construction is done, sometimes before the construction has actually even begun. And then again, the purpose for all these is different. We have business for office and retail properties and industrial properties, residential for multifamily and condominiums, and then business or leisure for hotels. One final difference between all these different property types is that the revenue and expenses are a lot more granular for office, retail, and industrial properties because there are fewer tenants. If you only have 5 or 10 tenants in your office building, you care a lot about what each one is paying you, special terms like free rent, when each one's lease expires, things like that. But if you have an apartment building with 500 units in it, you don't really care that much about what each person does individually. With 500 units or even 50 or 100 units, there are so many people in that building that you tend to take a much higher level view of what's happening. Examples of more granular details for office, retail, and industrial properties include lease renewals and expirations. You often try to probability weight what will happen. You might have a certain number of free months of rent that you give to tenants when they come in as new tenants or when they renew. And then you will also have commissions that are paid to brokers for finding individual tenants. You'll also have items called tenant improvements, which individual tenants can specify and ask for and involve customizing the space that they inhabit. So if we were to create some type of line or arrow here with normal companies on one side and then properties that are very different from normal companies on the other side, it would look something like this. Office, retail, and industrial properties, and arguably condominiums, should be all the way on the right side as being very different because of the amount of detail that goes into revenue and expenses for office, retail, and industrial properties, and for the timing issues with condominiums. We start selling the individual units to people before the construction has finished, and they pay us throughout as the construction is progressing. By contrast, multifamily and hotels are much closer to normal companies. Hotels are probably the closest to normal companies out of everything here. Multifamily is a little bit closer because we don't have any timing issues for the most part. Also, we don't go into quite as much detail on the revenue and expenses in most cases. The types of revenue and types of expenses are different. So in that sense, these are different from normal companies, but they're still closer than condos and office, retail, and industrial properties. We get questions about other property types like storage, student housing, nursing, lumber, or even other more specialized property types. And the truth is they're all variations of the types above. In most cases, whatever you're dealing with is going to be a variation of multifamily or office, retail, and industrial. Hardly anything else fits into the condo category because relatively little else is actually pre-sold. So think about the number of tenants and the granularity of the revenue and expenses. Something like student housing, for example, is basically just a multifamily property because students stay there for about a year in most cases. You have so many students staying there that it's not worth tracking individuals. And so it falls far more closely into the multifamily category. In terms of strategies and how to make money with all this, the two basic options are to build a new property or to acquire an existing one. Now, beyond those high-level distinctions, we would say that there are 4 main strategies when it comes to real estate. First, you can develop a property and sell it upon completion. So you could go in with a developer and build a new office or a new shopping center or a new apartment complex or a new hotel. You get some equity and then you borrow from lenders to get the funds required to do this. And then as you complete it, you start attracting tenants or you start operating it if it's a hotel, and then you eventually sell it to another party. Another option is to develop a property and then pre-sell it. And this one really just applies to condominiums for the most part. Sometimes you'll see mixed use properties that have some units that are also pre-sold, but for the most part, this is something that is more common with condominiums. So with this one, the main difference is that you don't have to wait until the property is done to start earning something back from it. Instead, you can start collecting those deposits fairly early on, keep collecting them throughout the process, and then by the end, in theory, you should be entirely paid back and earn something on top of the construction costs. A third strategy is to acquire an existing property, so not develop anything, just acquire something that already exists and then do nothing. And this applies to pretty much everything except for the condos. You could acquire an office building, a retail building like a shopping center, a hotel, a multifamily complex, and you could just let it sit there and do nothing and hope that prices go up or that occupancy rates go up or something else happens to improve the profile of the property. And then the fourth strategy is to acquire an existing property but change it, to renovate it or redevelop it, or otherwise make significant changes to boost its appeal, to get better tenants, to get them to pay more, to reduce the expenses, to do something else like that to get more for your money. The first two strategies here are often referred to as opportunistic. The third strategy is referred to as core, and then the fourth strategy is referred to as core plus or value added. The dividing lines between these are sometimes a little bit thin, but that's how you can think about it. The riskiest strategies are at the top, the third strategy is the least risky, and the fourth strategy is somewhere in between the risk and potential returns of the others. If we were to do a side-by-side comparison with my ridiculous smiley faces here, we'd say this develop and sell upon completion strategy is pretty common for everything except for condominiums. For condos, occasionally, yes, you will see this where people sell some of the units in advance and then sell some upon completion. So that's why this is yellow instead of red. But for the most part, it's a lot more common for the other property types. Then there's develop and pre-sell before completion, which really only happens for condominiums, and for the others, you don't worry about it. And then there's acquire existing and do nothing, which is probably the most common for office, retail, industrial, and multifamily properties. It doesn't really happen for condos because you'd have to buy the units individually from the individual owners, which is not usually a great use of time for large institutions. And then for hotels, you can acquire existing hotels and not do much, but I would say it's not quite as common for hotels as the last strategy, which is to acquire an existing property and renovate it, which is pretty common for offices, retails, industrials, multifamilies, and also hotels, but again, not quite so common for condominiums. For condos, basically you have to worry about development for the most part and pre-selling units and possibly selling additional units upon completion. One final point before we move on is that the financing also varies quite a bit between these different strategies. There are three loan types in most real estate projects: construction loans, bridge or temporary loans, and permanent loans. Construction loans, as the name implies, are used for new developments. But what tends to happen is that once the new development is done and it starts attracting tenants, people start moving in, or it starts operating for a hotel, the construction loan gets refinanced into a permanent loan. So the old lenders want out, the new lenders who want to back a more stabilized property come in, and the loan is refinanced and permanent loan funding is put in place. With a bridge or temporary loan, often this is used for acquisitions or for value-added deals with renovations where the property exists, but the new owner wants to change it around. And often this one is also refinanced. Once the changes are done and the property reaches stabilization, this one will often be refinanced and replaced with a permanent loan. Now, permanent loans are there for properties that are not expected to change too much. So acquiring a stabilized property that's not going to change too much. Often this is split into senior debt and mezzanine debt. Senior debt is backed by collateral, and it might support anywhere from 60 to 70 to 80% of the property's value. And then if you want to go beyond that, you can use mezzanine to go up a little bit higher to more like 80 to 90% of the property's value. Now, the percentages, the interest rates, the terms all vary based on the region. This is just a rough idea of what you might expect to see. So that's a quick overview of the different property types and strategies. Let's go over how to use this course. First off, I strongly recommend using the quick reference guide linked to below this lesson. We lay out the most important lessons and sections to focus on depending on the area of real estate that you'll be working in or interviewing for. Generally speaking, if you're on the commercial real estate, development, brokerage side, the lending side, or real estate private equity, you want to focus on the individual property related lessons. And if you're in investment banking or at a hedge fund that focuses on REITs, then you want to focus on the REIT related lessons. If you're pressed for time, focus on the shorter 30, 60, or 90-minute case studies in this introductory module, of which there are many, and skip the more complex ones later on. We introduce the concepts in these shorter case studies up front and then go into more detail with more granular models later on. Now, if you have more time or you're on the job, then it is worth looking at the real estate private equity case studies if you're working with individual properties, or if you're on the investment banking or hedge fund side, take a look at the REIT lessons and you'll get a lot out of those. Let's do a quick recap and summary. This course covers two main topics, individual properties and real estate investment trusts, and it's intended to get you up to speed quickly for purposes of case studies, interviews, and if you're on the job, learning a new sector or a new property type. This course does not cover every single bell and whistle out there. So no, our models are not the most complex. You will find more detailed models and examples elsewhere, but we aim for efficiency rather than complexity. We don't cover Argus. We don't cover non-Excel based software. We don't cover basic Excel accounting and finance concepts. You should already know those if you're taking this course. And finally, we don't cover anything outside of individual properties and REITs. So if you want a home building case study or commercial mortgage-backed securities, you're not going to find it here. We went through the different property types and strategies, the first category being office, retail, and industrial properties, then multifamily, then condominiums, and then hotels and hospitality. And you saw all the differences in terms of customer type, use case, lease length, and lease type. Then for the different strategies, you saw how you can develop a property and sell it when it's done, how you can develop and pre-sell units for condominiums, how you can acquire a property and do nothing, or acquire a property and renovate it. And you saw some of the differences there, along with the financing differences and how there are different types of loans to correspond to the different strategies and what you can do with individual properties. And then finally, we went through how to use this course and what to focus on depending on the area that you're interested in. That's it for this lesson. Coming up next, you are going to get started with your first simple case study based in Excel. I believe the best way to learn this material is by doing it and practicing everything in real time. So we're going to skip as much boring explanation as possible and just dive into Excel and learn how to answer some simple case study questions in the real estate industry.